welcome to the first video in Traficom's FSTD video series. This video opens a series which is aimed at FSTD operators. FSTD stands for Flight Simulation Training Device, so it means full flight simulators, flight training devices, and flight and navigation procedures trainers. This video may still be beneficial to any other aviation experts. The purpose of this video is to share knowledge of requirements and good practices regarding compliance monitoring systems and to raise ideas to auditors. Pilots are trained to monitor their instruments. Any change should be identified and acted accordingly. Aviation organizations must have a compliance monitoring system, CMS. It serves similarly as an instrument to a pilot. The purpose of the CMS is to continuously monitor compliance, how well the organization fulfills the rules and requirements. It is not effective only to check if the minimum requirement is fulfilled. An effective compliance monitoring is periodically measuring the level of compliance. It is a bit challenging to measure or estimate the level of compliance. But if you use perhaps 3 different levels of compliance, it would be straightforward to classify your level for each measured process. To give you more ideas, perhaps those levels could be like adequate, operational, and effective. By measuring the level, it is possible to see the trends, and that is the key to effective compliance monitoring. What gets measured gets managed. Our operations should be effective. Let's see an old film. This film shows a Ford assembly line about 100 years ago. Note how effectively the assembly line functions. This happens when everyone knows their tasks and can do them. Tasks are done in the correct sequence. Parts and tools are immediately available, and they are designed to support the process. There are no unnecessary tasks or waiting. Things literally roll forwards smoothly. That is our goal as well. Compliance monitoring system aims at ensuring compliance with the requirements. Compliance is difficult to achieve if the operations and processes are not effective. And effectiveness saves time and money. In other words, compliance, effectiveness, and cost savings have a lot in common. Any process in aviation should function well, with the same principles as you saw on the film. For example, there are many tasks and steps that have to happen before a flight training session in a flight simulator can happen. They all have to be performed in a certain order. The flight simulator must be qualified, and the training organization must monitor any changes in the FSTD qualification certificate. The training organization must obtain approval from the competent authority to use the device in the planned training. The instructors must be familiarized with the characteristics of this individual device. For example, the instructor stations are different between different devices, and the safety systems and evacuation arrangements vary as well. The instructors must review the list of open defects before the flight session. If there are any issues, they must be noticed during the briefing and training session. Training session happens if something can't be accomplished, for example due to a temporary failure of the simulator. The instructor must notice it in the student's training records. If there are any problems with the simulator, the instructor must report that in the simulator's logbook, so that maintenance can initiate corrective actions. Each of these steps have many smaller steps, and there are many other steps that were not included in this example. Each of these mentioned steps require cooperation between the training organization and FSTD operator. Therefore, it is essential that all the steps are simple and intuitive. These steps are called as procedures, and the procedures together form the process. A process has a purpose. A process has a beginning and ending. It should always happen in the same way. We can and should think everything as processes, and we should identify and make it clear what are the required steps within those processes. Just by simply listing those steps, we have already created a description of that process. This way, our actions can be as effective as an assembly line, and we can monitor how well we are doing. Compliance monitoring should use audits and inspections to gather data and evidence of the level of compliance. Here you see the definitions of audits and inspections. An audit means a systematic process that includes document reviews and interviews. It should focus on how the audited process functions. For example, if we are auditing simulator defect rectification, we wish to see that the maintenance personnel respond to any user complaints quickly, verify if the complaint is valid, ensure that the correct information of the issue is available to the users while the issue remains open, and take actions to rectify the issue, confirm corrective actions as successful, and so on. So audits should focus on if the processes start, function, and end as they should. In other words, do the processes function as described in the manuals? Many processes depend on other processes. For example, simulators QTG testing may be triggered by a software configuration control process. Do these interconnections work as they should? All the aspects should be audited at least once per year. An audit requires planning, preparation, documentation, and follow-up. Frankly, it takes some effort to conduct and close an audit. An inspection is a quick review of any simple entity. It could be just a check that the test logs are as they should, maintenance records are maintained, file archives are updated, defects being responded to, and so on. It could also mean monitoring of how any person performs their task, such as if the correct work orders and checklists are used, and so on. The point is that an inspection is a quick conformity check that can be accomplished easily. Such checks can be done often without using much time, but they serve in clearly indicating the everyday status of compliance. When there are changes, such as changes to procedures, organization, fleet, or so on, additional ad hoc audits or inspections should be performed to ensure compliance after the changes. Any change may always have a significant impact on any organization. For example, a new checklist may be taken into use, but if its contents are not informed and trained to all the associated personnel, then it is clear that mistakes will happen later. To understand if we are compliant or not, we need to understand the requirements. Aviation requirements in the EU have been structured as in this image. In this video, we are focused on FSTD requirements. They are included in the aircrew domain, so let's see that in better details. The top-level requirement is the so-called basic regulation. It is binding in its entirety. Aircrew regulation is a high-level regulation published by the EU Commission. The applicable requirements are in its annexes. They are known as Part FCL and Part ORA. They are important to you. They are detailed and binding requirements. Part FCL and Part ORA have been further amended by Acceptable Means of Compliance (AMC) and Guidance Material GM. They give details on how the requirement should be interpreted and fulfilled. The FSTD operator's organization and processes should fulfill the requirements listed here. The FSTD devices themselves have technical requirements. There are CSFSTD requirements for airplanes and helicopters. These requirements gain new amendments. Again, the technical standards for FSTD devices are given in a separate regulation, while the requirements concerning the organization and procedures are given in other regulations. The requirements published by the EU Commission are presented in green. The requirements published by EASA are presented in blue. Part Aura is something you should be very well familiar with. It has been divided into subparts. To gain an FSTD qualification certificate, you must fulfill the requirements in subparts Gen and FSTD. When studying the requirements, we can learn what is required. By expanding our thinking, we can think of what processes we need to establish to gain the FSTD qualification certificate. Remember, it is all about processes. To make something work, we need to establish standard ways to do something and in certain order. Part Aura has a lot of requirements. It can be concluded that an FSTD operator should have at least these procedures established and functional. If you are familiar with the FSTD requirements, this list should make sense to you. Traficom's future videos will focus on these processes. Other aviation organizations, such as training organizations, will have a very different list of required processes. It is critical that the standard procedures are written and are clear. Only then your personnel can successfully perform their duties. But mistakes are still always made, so we need oversight. Oversight is beneficial also because when the processes function effectively, time and money is saved too. Auditing is mainly performed by interviewing personnel, reviewing documents and information systems and premises. The purpose is to observe and dig deep enough. When there is a need to dig deeper, it means that more people should be interviewed and more documentation should be sampled. That way it can be ensured if an identified mistake was an isolated and individual mistake or a systematic failure that happens often. By doing this, the auditor also collects clear evidence to support the audit result. Later, it is possible to return to that evidence to see how the level of compliance has changed. Remember that it is important to be able to measure things. By being able to measure or define that there has been a change in the level, then it is possible to take decisions and actions and see how the past decisions have affected. Much of auditing is actually listening, so an auditor should have good ears. The auditor should listen to the interviewees and ask further questions. More on this on the following pages. On this page, you will see how the auditor could and should perform an audit. The first step is to define the scope of the audit. Will the audit focus on one core process or on multiple? Study the manuals and regulations that concern the processes to be audited. It will be easy to find aspects that should be reviewed during the audit. Identify where a process connects to other processes. Those connections define where the processes start. When auditing, we wish to see a track from the beginning of a process to its end. Only then we can determine if that flow functions. Second, prepare high-level questions based on the requirements and manuals. For example, how do you fulfill a requirement in Aura Gen 160? Or the manual chapter 5 tells about spare part management. Could you demonstrate how this chapter and real life correspond to each other? Decide sampling. Auditing is based on sampling. It is only rarely possible to review all the evidence related to a process, so we are reviewing only part of the evidence, so we use the word sampling. Decide what documentation you wish to see and whom to interview, and which high-level questions should be asked from each interviewee. The audit happens. Begin with a briefing telling how the audit will happen, the schedule of interviewees, and so on. During interviews, start with the high-level questions and listen carefully. Observe the responses of the interviewees. Keep the atmosphere as friendly and open, but take notice when the interviewees hesitate with their answers. It could be a signal that an answer to the question is not known, and if the personnel can't answer to relevant questions, it is problematic. By listening, you can easily identify the important part of the answers. Ask further questions on the details to learn how the processes function. Does it sound that it functions on mature level, or does it sound that there is room for improvement? Good follow-up questions are always, for example, what would you change in this process? Or what did you mean by saying? Ask also closed-loop questions to get a definitive answer, such as who is responsible for that? Or when is that done? Or do you think that this functions as written in the manual? Or do you feel confident doing these tasks? Listen. Ask further questions until you understand the answers and have confidence on how the process functions. Identify possible problems. Due to human factors, problems often emerge when multiple persons work with the same process and they need to exchange information. Therefore, it is wise to interview more than one person to see evidence of the same process from other person's point of view also. Here it is important to identify where this process connects to other processes and where tasks are shared between persons. Ask questions on that. Ask details about how well the process flows in these cases. Is it typical to have miscommunications or delays? If yes, it may be a signal that you should dig even deeper. Move to another high-level question or to the next process. At the end, verify that you have evidence to support your opinion on the results. Evidence can be your memo on the interviews, copies of documentation, photographs, and so on. Something that you can again review at a later stage. Have a debriefing and go verbally through the results. Prepare an audit report. If there are findings or recommendations, be sure to specify them clearly so that the reader understands what was the problem and if it relates to a certain paragraph in the manuals or requirements. Part Aura has the subpart Gen as for general. It has a very important paragraph, Aura Gen 200. You should remember its contents. Many other requirements just add details to it or explain it. Those contents are presented on the following pages together with the examples of high-level questions that you can use during any audit. Those questions apply to anyone through the whole organization, so you can start with questions like these when interviewing the top management or operational personnel. The first paragraph in this requirement says that an organization shall establish, implement, and maintain clearly defined lines of responsibility and accountability. But first, what does responsibility and accountability mean? The responsible persons are the individuals who actually complete a task. The responsible person is responsible for action or implementation. Responsibility can be shared. The degree of responsibility is determined by the individual who has accountability. The accountable person is the individual who is ultimately answerable for the activity or decision. Accountability is taking ownership of a responsibility. This includes an authority to say yes or no and veto power. Only one accountable person can be assigned as accountable of an action. Accountability is answerability, blameworthiness, liability, and the expectation of account giving. For example, I am responsible for keeping paper in the printer, and I am accountable for my actions if paper runs out. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from any person in an organization. Now, back to the requirement. The responsibilities and accountabilities must be clearly defined. It would indeed be tough to work in an organization that does not know who is responsible and accountable for its tasks. And because it is here in this top level requirement, it is really mandatory that the responsibilities and accountabilities are clearly defined and understood. Please note that FSTD operators and their manuals must define the accountabilities. For example, the QTG process must define who may perform the tests and who may approve them. The configuration control process must define who ultimately approves a change to be taken into training use. And there should be a single person accountable for deciding if the functions and subjective test result is satisfactory or not. Those and any other decisions can't be shared, but a single person must be accountable and defined. Secondly, there shall be a description of the overall philosophies and principles of the organization with regard to safety. That can be referred to as the safety policy. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from anyone in the organization. Safety policy is a declaration signed by the manager. It indicates the principles on how safety is maintained within the organization. While a policy may sound like an unnecessary statement on a piece of paper, it is still a fundamental declaration. Typically, the policy indicates that the organization should strive for a very good level of safety. When such a statement is signed by the top management, it gives the liberty to the operational personnel to really do and focus on safety. No one can pressure you to skip your tasks or cheat on them to expedite something, because that would be against the safety policy. In other words, the safety policy protects you in multiple ways. Third, a safety management system or SMS is required. It consists of different means to identify hazards, define risks, mitigate the risks, monitor safety, identify safety trends, and guide decision making through safety oriented thinking. Much of safety management is just common sense. We should use all the means there are to maintain safety. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from anyone in the organization. In the world of flight simulation, it is sometimes asked, why do we need safety management? Because flight simulators fly only on ground. Real flight safety is not affected, right? Well, the main purpose of safety management system for an FSTD operator is to ensure that the users of the training devices gain only positive learning in the devices. If the training device is not working correctly, the student pilots may learn wrong actions or may understand things in a wrong way. That is called negative training and negative transfer of training. They may create a hazard, incident, or accident later while operating in a real aircraft. In other words, the FSTD devices indeed have an important role in the aviation safety. There are many things that can be trained only in training devices and not in real aircraft. For example, engine fire, TCAS, EGPWS events, wind shears, overweight landings, and so on. The training devices must function correctly so that the training is positive. The safety management system is there to verify this and to mitigate the risks. Never underestimate the need for a safety management system in flight simulation. Fourth, the organization shall maintain personnel trained and competent. Please focus on the word competent. Imagine that a new person is hired to your company. Someone gives them training. Is the person then fully ready to start independent work? Not likely. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from anyone in the organization. Training is always welcomed, but it is required to ensure that the personnel is competent. We all can go happily through any training session, but we may not have learned much. Therefore, the competency must be ensured. Has the person learned the needed skills, information, and mindset to work independently? How could we do that? Good methods that are useful are the following. You could define certain competency levels within your organization. Even your manual may tell that a certain task may be performed by a person with an entry level competency, but the person who is accountable must have a higher competency level. Working with a tutor is an effective way of learning safely. Any task should be practiced enough many times so that the tutor gradually steps more and more to the background. When the competency level of a person should be changed, it should be done in a mutual understanding between the person, tutor, and supervisor. That would ensure that the person is ready for the next level tasks. Competency is critical. This item requires documentation of all key processes. It is so important that it is highlighted here with yellow color. So the requirement to document the processes concern all the processes listed here by Aura Gen 200. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from anyone in the organization. Documentation is the key to compliance management. If a process is not documented, then the personnel don't know how exactly it should be performed. And further, the organization and the auditors are unable to verify if the operations have been done properly or if the process functions correctly. Processes should be documented in a way that is suitable to the organization and the process in question. Then the requirement says that an organization shall establish, implement, and maintain a compliance monitoring system. That is the topic of this video. CMS uses audits, inspections, management meetings, and reviews to monitor compliance and to identify areas where corrective actions must be taken. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from anyone in the organization. Many other paragraphs in Part Aura expand this requirement and also give guidance. They indicate that compliance monitoring system may be simplified for the smallest organizations. Please study Part Aura and its AMCs to learn about the details. This last item refers to other European aviation requirements. It may be that an organization has gained certificates as an approved training organization and as an FSTD organization. Because of this seventh item, all the required processes should be managed under one management system. So even if you have two or multiple certificates, you still should have only one management system. That is just logical. It would be problematic to keep separate management systems within the same organization. Here you can see examples of high-level questions that the auditor can ask from anyone in the organization. These questions are also applicable to any process that is being audited. Hopefully, the example questions have been beneficial to you and give you a starting point on how to start interviews during audits. So we have reviewed the requirements of Aura Gen 200. All its items are very important. You should remember these and remember where to find them. The audits should ensure that these requirements are fulfilled. Item number 5 is still highlighted. It is applicable to all the key processes. Let's focus on this on the next page. It is required that the key processes are documented. Use any method that is suitable to you and to the process in question. Here you can see a few examples. Sometimes it is effective to describe the process textually. For example, it may be natural to describe the process of routine meetings this way. So the manual could describe how often certain meetings happen, who participates, what is the purpose of the meeting, and so on. Example text here is in Latin. Do not pay attention to the words, but think about the layout and readability. Another method is to use a checklist format. This kind of presentation suits especially any logical tasks that are done in a sequence. For example, preparations for a recurrent FSTD evaluation could use this format. Message to the authority, agree on the dates and schedule, reserve the FSTD, reserve personnel, prepare documentation, and so on. Process charts have the benefit of strongly visualizing the flow and to show where decisions and actions are made and what are the consecutive paths. For example, it could be wise to describe a QTG test process this way. Is the test correctly initialized? Is the result acceptable? Do a second run if the test fails. Write to the log, and so on. Any process could be described by using any of these three methods, but probably in your mind you already now have an opinion what method you would choose for your manual for a certain process. Good. Use your freedom to choose the method that suits you and the process. The auditor should listen carefully and ask further questions based on the answers until it is clear if the process functions correctly and systematically or not. Let's observe an imaginary discussion between an auditor and an auditee being interviewed.
Could you show me the process description regarding our simulator's reliability analysis?
Oh, we don't have anything written on that. It is my job. I know what I am doing.
If you get sick and your colleagues substitute you, how do they know how to do it?
Well, I get sick very rarely. I am the only one who knows how to do the reliability report.
What do you think? What did the discussion indicate? Was there any problem? If yes, what was the problem? We could say that there is a potential finding. The interviewee said that the process is not described in a written format, but it is required to be documented. It may be only a misunderstanding of one person, so this should be brought up in discussions with other persons to confirm if the documentation really is missing. Let's listen to the discussion a little further.
Who makes decisions based on the simulator's reliability report?
I just upload the data to our cloud server. I don't know who reads it.
What is your opinion on this discussion now? The interviewee just uploads the data to the server but does not know if anyone reads it. Basically, it is not problematic. We don't always need to know what happens to information or product that we send forward. But in real life, in typical organizations, everybody should know who is accountable for the reliability analysis process and decisions. Again, there is potentially an issue here. It needs to be confirmed by asking about this from other persons. Here, the interview gave indications that the process is not working at a mature level. This was only an interview of one person, so next the auditor should confirm these from other auditees and from documents. In other words, we need more objective evidence. As you can see, Aura Gen 200 lays down very important requirements and principles. They build a big picture, and the other requirements give detailed requirements. We should try to see both the big picture and the details. Therefore, it is good to start with the high-level questions and then go deeper into details by follow-up questions, and then later move into another high-level question that enables seeing both the big picture and the details. The auditor should make an official audit report to document what was audited, when, how, and with what results. It is not efficient to use a standard auditing checklist every single time. That would easily result in always repeating the same questions. It is more efficient to customize the questions and approach angles every time. The auditor still needs a checklist and memory aid. The following pages show one possible method. A memory aid could be as simple as presented here. The auditor knows the scope of the audit and then searches what references are applicable to the audited processes. This imaginary example is about auditing software configuration control. The auditor then prepares high-level questions to open the discussion of different topics. The auditor plans whom to interview. Rest of the paper is used for memo during the audit. But the auditor needs to review the applicable manual and requirements to raise more detailed questions. Let's see on the next page. It is easy to just take the applicable requirement and then highlight the points you plan to focus on. After that, more specific questions can be added to the print. Then later, during the audit, the auditor asks these questions and writes short notes onto the margin of the paper. Simple, yet efficient. Similar method could and should be used to mark focus points and questions on the operator's own manuals. The auditor should ensure that the organization operates as described in the manuals, and that the manuals describe how the organization operates. When the audit happens, the auditor uses the same papers as a memo of what was discussed with each person. The auditor writes notes of what documentation was reviewed and used as evidence. And the auditor writes notes of the results. Simultaneously, the lower level questions from the manual and requirements are raised. The auditor makes brief notes on the margin of that paper too. These kind of short memos are easy to make during discussions. It would be difficult to remember the facts and discussions afterwards. These simple notes will help in preparing the audit report. The memo presented here shows just the idea of a concept that has been useful for many auditors. Feel free to develop such a documentation concept that suits to you. Just be prepared to demonstrate what you have audited, what was the depth, what were the samples, what were the main questions, and what were the results. Compliance monitoring takes some effort. It is sometimes asked that if the operations have been on an adequate level, why is continuous monitoring with all the audits and inspections still required? The short answer is because of changes. Our organization may change. There are sometimes new requirements or new procedures we need to comply with. Our customers require something new, and we have to do it to maintain our business case. Our fleet may change, but even if it would remain the same, the devices get older and new challenges with aging of hardware may happen at any day. Because of these reasons, compliance monitoring should continuously monitor how the processes are functioning. There is also another answer. We need continuous monitoring because of the complacency cycle. It means how awareness and focus change with time. The next page explains this and emphasizes how compliance monitoring is beneficial. Complacency means satisfaction. If we are too satisfied with our operations, we may lose awareness and focus, as you will see on this page. Time is on the horizontal axis. If our awareness is quite low, we will make mistakes and sooner or later a severe failure, incident or accident will happen. That is alarming to us and we quickly raise our awareness and focus on this issue. It is natural that we take actions to ensure that the same failure does not happen again. We create methods to mitigate it from happening. After some time, we have become very focused. Due to our focus and efforts, the number of mistakes is very low. But when time goes by, it is difficult to maintain high level of focus. When things are going well, we may become complacent, too satisfied with the situation. It is really difficult to remain alert and focused on something that works fine, so we start losing the focus and awareness of this matter. As awareness and focus continue their descent, more and more mistakes happen until one day another severe failure happens and we start the same roller coaster ride again. So the complacency more or less goes in cycles. Awareness and focus go up and down. The period of the cycle may be even years. Complacency cycle is at different phase for different processes. An organization may be at the maximum awareness level for one process, but may be at the minimum awareness for some other processes. Complacency cycle is natural to us humans. We have multiple tasks and processes that we are taking care of. It is normal that when we focus strongly on something, our focus will drift from something else. And when we become satisfied about our success, we become complacent and we may lose our focus. In addition, there are many other humane reasons behind this. We all have our personal challenges, internal and external pressures, changes in the organization and procedures, and so on. These affect our capabilities and resources to focus. And failures happen easily when we are not focused. Therefore, we need to understand this cycle and monitor how we are doing on each different process. Compliance monitoring can and should monitor this. After all, it is quite simple. We can easily monitor the number of mistakes. We can also keep a log of them to see the trends. That will tell us where we are on the complacency cycle. Well, where do we get the information about mistakes? It is simple as well. Audits and inspections, internal reports from employees, and authorities' evaluation and audit reports provide such data. They all paint the big picture. Too often, an organization is just managing one finding or failure at a time without looking at the big picture. How many mistakes or findings do we have on this process? That information would also forecast the near future. Are we improving or the opposite? For flight simulation, an easy example is the QTG testing process. Each test should be approved by a dedicated person. The compliance monitoring and the authority will also review or sample the approved tests. If they find approved tests that should not have been approved, there has been a mistake or failure. By looking how often these cases happen, we can estimate where we are on the complacency cycle. By doing the same estimation for also other processes, we can see where we should be focusing, and we can manage our resources accordingly. This all is aimed to ensure compliance and aviation safety. Now it is time for some final words. The highest level requirement says that an applicant should demonstrate that it complies with the rules. Note that it is not the authority's task to search for the evidence of compliance. The applicant should establish methods to ensure compliance and to demonstrate that without any doubt. As a guideline, it can be said that when something is measured, it can be managed. If you are able to show that you can adequately and reliably measure the level of your compliance, you should be able to demonstrate it as well. And there are a lot of supportive documentation that can be used, such as management meeting records, logs, audit and inspection records, manuals, checklists, compliance matrices, gap analysis, and so on. Also, the authority understands that mistakes do happen, but diligent work should be done to mitigate systematic failures. In other words, our processes should function at a good level. It is a lot of work, but it is perfectly possible. A good starting point is to remember the top level requirements of Aura Gen 200 in every process. It takes time to make the processes mature and to keep them there. And a word of encouragement on how even small improvements pay off. The basic regulation requires continuous improvement. Indeed, there is always room for improvement. Continuous and even small enhancements will save your time and money and improve your compliance remarkably in the long run. How would you demonstrate that you are doing continuous improvement? Again, something should be measured either in qualitative or quantitative terms. This video should have given more ideas and answers to this question. Thank you for watching.